Imagine walking home one night, then the streets quiet, the air heavy, and suddenly, you stumble upon a scene you'll never forget. A woman lying still, lifeless, and the faint sound of footsteps disappearing into the darkness. You're frozen, unsure of what to do, but you know one thing for sure: she needs help. You call the police, trying to do the right thing. But instead of being thanked, you find yourself surrounded by officers, their eyes suspicious, their questions sharp. Now picture this. You try to explain, but no one seems to listen. Not because you don't want to, but because you can't. You've lived your whole life without the ability to speak. Not a single word has ever left your lips. For Alex, this isn't just a moment of confusion. It's the start of his worst nightmare. It's about the heartbreaking challenge of trying to clear his name when the very thing that could prove your innocence, your voice, is taken away from you. The police don't believe him. The evidence against him begins to pile up. Headlines across town scream, "Mute man accused of murder." And in a world where your voice is your most powerful tool to defend yourself, Alex has none. His hands, his eyes, even the notepad he uses to communicate. None of it seems enough to convince anyone of the truth. But here's the part that will leave you questioning everything. Alex didn't ask to be silent. He didn't choose this life. He was born this way, with a speech impairment that trapped his words inside his mind. He spent years being misunderstood, overlooked, and underestimated. Now, in the fight of his life, that silence is being used against him. Can you imagine how helpless he must feel? How alone? Accused of something so unthinkable, his friends doubt him, strangers judge him, and the justice system seems determined to see him as guilty. What would you do if you were in his shoes? How would you prove your innocence when no one wants to hear you? This story isn't just about a man accused of murder. It's about what happens when the world refuses to listen. And as you follow Alex's journey, I promise you, his fight for justice will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about silence, truth, and resilience. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you shocked.
Alex had never spoken a word in his life. Born with a speech impairment, he was unable to communicate the way most people did. He could hear perfectly well, understand what others said, and express his thoughts through gestures, writing, and sign language. But when it came to speaking, words just wouldn't come. It wasn't something Alex ever wished for, but it was his reality. And yet, despite this, he led a peaceful, content life in the quiet city where he lived. He worked as a librarian, helping others find books, sharing his love for stories without needing to speak a single word. People knew Alex as a kind, intelligent man who let his actions speak louder than any voice could. But that all changed one cold, fateful night. It was a night like any other. The streets were empty, the chill of winter settling in. Alex had just closed up the library for the evening and was walking home when something unusual caught his eye. He noticed a man, rushing in the opposite direction, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. A flash of movement, a shout, and then the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Alex froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. He knew something was terribly wrong. By the time he decided to move closer, the fight was over. The man had disappeared into the shadows, and a woman's body lay lifeless in the alley. The scene was chaotic, but Alex didn't know what had happened. He never did see the attacker's face clearly, and by the time the police arrived, all he could do was point toward the alley, shaking his head, trying desperately to communicate what he had witnessed. But nothing came out. He tried to speak, to explain, but his voice refused to cooperate. In the urgency of the investigation, the authorities took Alex into custody. With no other witness, no way to explain himself, they quickly assumed the worst. The police thought Alex must have known something. How else could he be there, at the scene of the crime? His silence, they concluded, was guilt. The fact that Alex couldn't speak for himself only made them more suspicious. They viewed his muteness as an unwillingness to cooperate, and soon, he was labeled as the prime suspect. But Alex wasn't guilty. He hadn't harmed anyone. He didn't even know the woman's name. Yet, his silence became his greatest burden. In the coming weeks, the media got hold of the story. Headlines flashed across newspapers, accusing a silent killer. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Alex's inability to speak became twisted into a sign of evil. His family and friends couldn't believe it. They knew the man they loved. They knew his heart. But no one could speak for him in a way that would clear his name. They weren't there to see what happened that night. They couldn't prove what Alex had seen, or not seen. The case quickly became a public spectacle. Everyone had an opinion, but no one could see the truth. The trial was an exhausting ordeal for Alex. Day after day, he sat quietly in the courtroom, his hands trembling as he tried to express his innocence through gestures, through notes he passed to his lawyer, Emily. Emily, a lawyer who had been friends with Alex since they were children, stood by him with unwavering support. She knew the truth, but proving it in a court of law was another matter. Her legal strategies were met with doubt, and every attempt to introduce new evidence was shot down. The key issue? No one could understand the evidence from Alex's perspective. The security footage, the notes, the gestures, it was all so unclear to those who didn't know him. The prosecution painted him as cold, calculating, and incapable of showing remorse, all because they misunderstood his silence. Alex's inability to speak was now being used against him, every attempt to communicate seen as an attempt to hide the truth. It was in these moments that Emily realized the difficult truth: Alex wasn't just fighting to clear his name. He was fighting to be heard in a world that refused to listen. She spent countless hours speaking to the judge, to the jury, trying to explain what they were missing. But the harder she tried, the more the walls closed in. One afternoon, Emily's frustration reached a boiling point. After a grueling day in court, she left the building with Alex in tow. She had hoped that the new evidence she found, footage showing a different suspect entering the area before the crime, would be their breakthrough. She showed the footage to the prosecutor, but the response was dismissive. The prosecutor didn't care. He didn't see the person in the footage. He didn't care about the blurry outline, or that it was the key to clearing Alex's name. His response was cold, almost dismissive, but it wasn't the last straw. Emily refused to let it go. She knew that no one would listen unless she took drastic action. But what could she do when the system was stacked so firmly against her? The days bled into weeks, and Alex's hope began to fade. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Each day, he was reminded of the heavy weight of his silence. Each day, he sat in that sterile courtroom, his hands shaking, his mind racing, trying to think of any way to get his side of the story out. But he couldn't speak. And no one seemed to care that he couldn't. Emily, on the other hand, was determined. She knew that if she didn't find a way to reach the jury, to show them what Alex was truly going through, then they might never understand him. One night, as Alex lay in his prison cell, staring at the ceiling, Emily had an idea. She rushed back to the courthouse, desperate to do anything she could to make her case. She knew that words wouldn't work, not in the traditional sense, but maybe, just maybe, there was another way to reach them. She spent the next few days gathering all of Alex's personal writings, the notes he had passed to her, his journals, anything that showed his truth. She organized the writings into a presentation. She even recorded an emotional video of herself speaking, explaining Alex's life, his struggle, his fight for justice, and his frustration at being misunderstood. When the next court session began, Emily entered with her presentation. She asked the judge for permission to show it to the jury. And this time, the judge agreed. As the lights dimmed and the video began, Alex's heart raced. The images on the screen showed a man who wanted nothing more than to be heard, someone who, despite his silence, had so much to say. The jury sat in stunned silence as Emily narrated Alex's story, highlighting moments of his life that were never considered. They saw his struggle, his fear, his desire for justice. It wasn't just the facts of the case anymore, it was Alex himself, fighting with everything he had, without ever saying a word. Now, I want to ask you, what would you do if you found yourself in Alex's shoes? How would you fight for your innocence when the world refuses to hear you? What would be your first step if you couldn't speak, but your life depended on being understood? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. This story is a reminder that sometimes, the greatest struggles are fought without words. It's about understanding that silence doesn't mean guilt, and that everyone, no matter their ability to speak, deserves to have their voice heard. In a world where we often judge based on what we hear, we need to remember to listen, and to fight for the voiceless, especially when it seems like no one is listening. As for Alex, well, you'll have to wait to hear the rest. But one thing's for sure, the truth is always waiting to be uncovered, and Alex is about to find the strength to speak in ways no one could ever expect. Stay tuned for the next chapter of his story, because what happens next is something you will be extremely shocked. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And let's make sure that no one, especially someone like Alex, is ever left in the silence again.